Before we start the video, I would like to give credit to everyone that has helped developing this understanding of the game. Even if it's just taking a couple of minutes out of their day to help test something, or if it is spending hundreds of hours testing in-game. I would also like to say that none of the people involved in gaining this understanding of the game are developers or moderators, nor have any of us looked at the source code. So this video mainly reflects our understanding based on observations and what happens in-game. As a last thing before we start the video, if there are any Artix Entertainment moderators, developers, or staff members watching, I would really appreciate it if you took a look at the discussion section of this video. For this very first section, we are going to take a look at the more technical stuff surrounding a game like Adventure Quest Worlds. Now what I'm going to go over is most likely not 100% accurate, but it gives a look into how the game might work. And the first thing to know when playing an online player game is that you are not playing on the servers. The servers are just a medium of conveying necessary information between players within a map or a room. So you are mainly playing the game on your own system, where the server allows for multiple players to connect their games together. Now since there's a connection between your client, the server, and other clients, there's bound to be some delay, also known as ping, which can create conflicting situations for the server when it gets information not up to date, which we will explore in later sections. Now Adventure Quest Worlds in itself is an event-based game, meaning that you do something, then there is an event or a reaction happening to that thing, which means that you can have multiple processes going on at once. An example of this is that you can move and attack at the same time. You're not bound to just moving or just attacking. It's also useful to know that when we are talking about the location of a character in this game, we are talking about its shadow, not the actual cosmetic items it has on, since the size of the items does not change either the attack range or the location we portray a character. It's the shadow that matters. It's also useful to know that pressing 1 triggers both an attack but also what's called a dashing event. And this dashing event is treated just as a click. So when we are talking about changing your location or a click, you can also categorize dashing under that category. So for this first section, we're going to take a look at in-game movement. We're going to take a deep look at the behavior we see in-game and try to explain some of the more complex situations and anomalies that we observe. I think it's a good idea to take a step back and start from scratch when assessing each type of these sections so everyone can follow the thought process of how we have built up this understanding. So how the game interprets movements is by taking mouse inputs, so left clicks, and what it does is it takes the current position and the clicked position, then traces a line for your character to follow a path, where the variable determining our position on this line is time. So essentially what we can say is that we have an ongoing trace event from one location to another location, where it compares timestamps of the first location and the last location and determines how long it should take to walk on that line. So expanding on this idea between multiple players' view, you can see that the same type of behavior is seen on both of the players' view. Now the interesting thing is, even if the characters are disaligned, we see that they take the current position for the player's view, then takes the new input, their new location, and draws that line, which means that there is no unified way of this trace event, which means that it happens locally for each of the players. So then what we can say is that for each player, they have a tracing event where the server conveys each of the click a player does and broadcasts it to every player within the room. Then locally on each of the player's view, they then create each of their tracing events. So that brings the question, do these tracing events ever get cancelled? And we see that when you have an ongoing tracing event, for the duration that the trace is lasting, since it's happening locally, overwrites any sort of broadcast location from the server, which means that when you're going between rooms, you'll still see the continuation of an ongoing tracing event. And since each player can have their own ongoing tracing events happening for only them to see, you get no unified way of viewing your location. What behavior we see when you have no ongoing local traces is that the server only broadcasts the last clicked location for each of the player. The last click location, if you are hopping into a room and then spawn at spawn location without clicking anywhere else, then that spawn location becomes your last click. Now these sort of teleports are called last click teleports, where you're going into a room with no ongoing tracing events happening and you just see the last click location of a player. And it's quite easy to see that the last click location doesn't necessarily mean that that is the actual location of that player. Looking at the examples, we can see that players can have different locations, as we also saw with tracing. Which brings us to a type of this location which are called character separations. Now character separations are when the actual player's location and the server's broadcasted locations are different. Which means that if someone enters the room, they will see a player at a different location than the player actually is indefinitely. So it's important to keep in mind that trace teleportations are local displacement of a character, while character separation is when the server broadcasts a wrong or inaccurate location of a player. The most notable character separation we can see is when we are dashing, since for our view we are speeding up towards the opponent while no other player can see this speed up. Now this creates an actual separation between the location that you see and the location that is being viewed by other players, since it doesn't take into an account for this speed up. But I think the easiest way to look at a clear example of character separation is when you are involving stun. The way stuns work is that when a player uses a stun, it sends a request forward to the server that this person is locked in this location, and then the server never broadcasts any updated location for that player during the event. Since in theory a stun should not allow a player to move in any sort of way while getting stunned, this is actually not the case, since you can still use dashing to move your character while being stunned. There is another notable mention of how a character separation can occur. Now this way of character separation is called pointer click teleportation, and it happens when you're hopping between rooms or change your location using dashing. You're actually telling the servers after it has decided that you're going to be at spawn that your location is different from the spawn location, while since it takes time for your game to load, that information doesn't get updated and you get placed at spawn, which we can quite clearly see here. Now we're going to take a deeper look at pointer click teleportations after we have looked at how hopping works, but before that there is one last notable teleportation I would like to mention. Now this teleport is actually a teleportation that you yourself can see, while your opponents do not see this teleport. It's called instant teleport. Essentially it works the opposite way of a pointer click teleportation, where you get placed at spawn but the server is broadcasting your position to be somewhere else. An instant teleport is where your character gets displaced into a location you are trying to move to, while the server broadcasts you at spawn location. So these two teleportations are sort of opposite. For the next section I feel it's natural to cover hopping between rooms, since it builds upon movement, and it's the big differentiator between Doom Arena and Blood Red Brawl. And as we did with looking at movement, we're going to take a step back and assess it from the basics. So how you initiate a hop is that your trace passes through one of the designated areas, which is different for each room, but is marked with an arrow. Now this means that the line just has to pass through, not necessarily that one of your clicks has to be in that area, which is quite important to notice. What happens after you have initiated a hop, we're going to take a look at frame by frame. So you can see that it suddenly goes from being in one room into the next room. But when you're in the next room, you can only see the room that you're in. There are no monsters or players loaded onto the map. Then for some frames later, we then see that the players and monsters appear in their correct location, or in a location is more precise to say. Now this is interesting since we did not see a difference before entering a hop, everything was just gone. But as we were loading into the next room, we had two different stages. One where the room was loaded and one where the player were loaded. Now this suggests that the loading of a room and the players are asynchronized events, which happens in the order of a room gets loaded, then players get placed onto the room. Now separating what happens when you're loading into a new room brings the question of where are the characters that are already loaded placed. And we see examples that indicate the solution implemented when we look at cutscenes of the PvE aspect of the game. We see that characters are placed outside of what you could consider as the game box. But for Blur Brawl, identifying where this location actually is, it doesn't help to look at the loading of a hop. It doesn't show the characters at all. But if we look at a glitch called roofing, we can get an indication of the location of the characters as the room gets loaded and players are just hanging out waiting to be placed on the map. So looking at locations of what's called a perfect roof, where you start a trace from the spawn location up to the location where players hang out while being loaded into the map, we can actually see that all of the locations are within a span equal to the map or the room you're loading into itself. So you can just say that there's a mirror box over the map with an equal spacing between where the characters are broadcasted or predicted to be. So it's just the position the characters will have when loaded into the room with a vertical offset as the room is being loaded. So you can define a hop into three positions, where you have entry location for the hop, which initiates going from one room to the other. Then you have the store location above a room as the room is being loaded. And then you have the spawn location, or the location a player will have after you have loaded into the room. Now what we call the area above the map where the character locations are stored as the room is being loaded is the storage box. Now it's interesting to look at the locations in the storage box. Since we cannot actually see that any players are at that location, we can do a test to see if it is an actual physical location or just associated locational value with the player, so not a physical location. By doing this test, I'm trying to hit someone as they are hopping through a room, and as you can see, we have no connection, which means that the storage box locations are not actually physical locations. Now I think it's noteworthy to mention that the storage box locations aren't the only locations you are able to go to outside of the main game box. You can actually go right above and right on the sides and actually under the box as well, through manipulating the dashing functionality to force your way through these invisible blocks. Now for PvP you have two invisible blocks implemented to fix one Doom Arena glitch where you could easily go into a location where no one could hit you. And these boxes have stayed, so making it to the side and completely under the map is a bit more difficult than you'd expect, but it is possible as shown. Now as we move into the next section about on how skills function, you might have questions on why the test I did earlier with checking if the storage box locations are actual physical locations, which is something you will be able to understand is a valid test after completely understanding how the game deals with applying damage and using skills to other players. As we did with the two last sections, taking a step back and starting from scratch is what we're going to do on this section as well. First we're going to look at is how attacking works. So what I've done is that I have two characters that have very high latency to the servers. We are talking a ping of over 200. And looking at the clip, you can clearly see that the skill firstly compares if an enemy is within attack range of that attack. Then secondly, you see a delay where the request is sent to the server. Then the server handles the information and sends a broadcast to the players involved with the damage information and or the effects being applied with the attack. From this analysis, we can conclude with two things. That firstly, there's a player side comparison that checks if a skill will be triggered. Once the skill is triggered, it's up to the server to calculate and broadcast the effects and damage the skill does. And just to make it clear, what you're seeing is the base attacker range, which is the attack range of the auto attack. And for many of the skills, especially for non-overpowered classes that have short range. So the next step we're going to do is to take a look at what happens when you are attacking and hopping from a room to another. Now there is a timing to this, but if we are able to take advantage of the two separate stages of attacking someone, one where you trigger the skill in one room and then for the next room the damage gets applied, we can use both tracing and the server side range to our advantage. And these type of hops is called a cross map. I'm going to go over the server side range later, so just keep that in mind that the range we get from a cross map is not equal to the range we get from just a regular attack. So just to give a brief overview of what we see when we try to map the different cross-mappable locations, we get two different boxes depending on the door we are hopping from. And we can clearly see that hopping from top, mid, and mid gives the largest cross-mappable area that we can take use of. Now I would like to bring in the things we learned when we looked at how the game traces or tracks locations. And when we look at the first part of Crossmap, it's important to remember that we see the last clicked location or the last broadcasted location of a player. So even if the player is not in the room, when we trigger the attack function from the player's view, it still uses that same location to compare if the attack will be triggered or not. And then when we go into the next room, it skips checking if the player is within range and is more focused on calculating and dealing the damage. Now what happens if the player is not within this cross-mappable area after is that since the skill is triggered but it does not connect, the skill just rolls, which is something we also looked at when we looked at character splits. So going outside of these cross-mappable areas can be used to counter an opponent who is going to cross-map you. Now there are other things we can do to counter cross-maps. As I talked about earlier, the last click location in a room is what the player remembers. So we change that location to be outside of the area where a hop gets triggered. There is no way for a player to both run the attack function as their trace is going into the hop area and for your last click location to be within that area, therefore making them not be able to trigger a skill and take advantage of a cross map. And these type of counter cross maps are called non-cross maps, or NCM for short. Now for those of you who are quite familiar with cross maps and NCMs might have a question about this situation. Is it possible to do an NCM from top mid to mid, which we're going to examine in the next section where we talk about more complicated situations where you need to have understanding of all the three sections we went over earlier. As I said in the last section, we're going to firstly look at how we can use our knowledge of tracing to give us the highest chance of trying to do a NCM from top mid to mid. I would like to say that the main point of this section is to give extensive proof and understanding on how the server differs when comparing locations from the player's view. So we're going to look at experiments that give us insight into the server side view. And I would also like to say that if there's something you don't understand completely in this section, I highly recommend going back and really trying to understand what we went over in the last sections, as it is crucial to understanding these experiments and what they tell us about the game. So looking at the hop area from the top mid bottom door, we can see that it's a long line at the bottom of the map where there are no single entry point that allows us to manipulate a line to go outside of this hop area. One of the things that we can implement into trying increase our chances of being outside of the attack range when an opponent hops is by looking at the small vertical attack range that each player has. If we are able to click low enough in the hoppable area, we might be able to be outside of the vertical attack range of an opponent. Though while examining how a player enters the hoppable location, there is a small delay, which means that if an opponent clicks far enough down when they are hopping, there is no guarantee that you will be outside of this vertical attack range. But by using the same principle, we can also manipulate our last click location to be horizontally quite far away from the location we actually hopped down, which might fool your opponent into thinking that you went down exactly at that point, but when in reality your last click trace is on the other side of the map. However, it's important to know that a crossmap depends on the current trace location, not the final destination, so an NCM like this leaves you vulnerable for quite some time. So in conclusion, there are no 100% guaranteed NCMs from top mid to mid. There are only what I'm going to call semi-NCMs, where all you can do is try and increase your chance by outsmarting your opponent. Now, as the main intention of this section is to prove that the server compares location differently, the next experiment we're going to look at is a pointer-click teleportation, which also includes getting stunned. By looking at the end result of this experiment, we can see that the actual broadcasted location is still at spawn, while for the player who got stunned, it's also at spawn. And since if you're trying to attack this opponent, your skills roll, that means that the server has tracked a different location from what you are seeing and what it's broadcasting. Now this implies that the server is actually tracking your movements and uses that location to compare when looking at an attack request incoming to the server. Now looking at the simpler example, I will now explain how we expand our understanding of how attacks work. Firstly, you have the section where the player checks if there is a player within the attack range of the skill being used. Then the server gets told that you are trying to use this skill on this or these people. Then the server takes the actual location that it has of the players and compare that to yours, and then checks if both of them are within a certain range. If the check passes, then it sends out to the players what damage is being dealt and what skills are being used or applied. An interesting observation when we looked at cross maps is that the horizontal distance is the same for the base range and the skill range that is being used, though we see that differs when looking at the vertical ranges, which explains perfectly why we see the cross-mappable areas when we look at cross maps. And this also goes to explain why if someone is teleporting around and you're trying to hit them, why sometimes your skills roll and other times you can hit them. It's all about the horizontal distance between the two characters, not the vertical. Looping back to pointer-click teleportations, now that we have established that the server independently tracks our locations when comparing for attack requests, it also does the same when comparing for a hop request. So when we look at situations like this, with our current understanding of pointer-click teleportations, it's easy to see why the characters get separated when you're clicking too much as you are hopping. This also means that pointer-click teleportations are the biggest reason for door lag. And as a last mention for this section, we have only been using the base attack range when we looked at cross-map examples or hit examples. Though there are skills with a larger hitbox than the base attack range, the same principles apply to those attack ranges. Before looking at smaller glitches and common strategies used to take advantage of these glitches, we're going to go back and look at flicker teleportations again, since they tell us something interesting that you can take advantage of. When looking at the flicker, and with our understanding from trace theory, we know that a local ongoing tracing event overrides the broadcasted locations from the server. But as we saw when we looked at hopping, the broadcasted location always gets the first priority when you hop into a room, since that's the order of how the next room is loaded. So looking at some examples of flickers, we can see that sometimes you are able to see the last click location of a player. That includes spawn location as well. But what seems to be the case, even if you don't see it, is that when someone is hopping, they will, for a short amount of time, be at that last click location. Which means that if someone is hopping into a room you're already in, they will be at the spawn location for a short amount of time, even if you don't see it. Now this means that we can take advantage of this and actually hit them. So even if they teleport when they enter a room, you will still be able to trigger an attack on them. Just to build upon the complexity of hopping from top mid down to mid, as we looked at in the last section, there is also a small area at the bottom door which counts as out of bounds. And this glitch is called the no path glitch, since that's the measures you get if you're trying to dash to someone at that location, since it counts out of bounds. So combining that with teleportations, you can use that area to be unhittable as long as you're able to keep your trace down at that area. Which brings us into the next glitch, which is chain teleportations. Essentially what it is that you continue a tracing event for an opponent to stay outside of their attack range for as long as possible. And a smart way to use chain teleportations is to use them at such a long distance away from the opponent that the opponent can't hit you. So by taking advantage of the side doors, you can easily start a trace like this. One smart thing you can do to take advantage of cross maps when you are rushing someone is by self-targeting and spamming as you approach the door, since that will ultimately trigger a cross map if the opponent is within the next room. And combining rushing with NCMing and teleporting as the opponent has to approach mid at some point might seem like an overpowered strategy, though you can easily implement what's called anti-NCM, which essentially is a last click teleportation when you go into the room a person is camping. Now again, as we talked about at the start of this section, is that flickers come really in handy here, since both players essentially are going to teleport for each other. If you have played it smart, at least in some lineups, both players can hit each other, so it balances each other out. And one thing I forgot to mention when I talked about self-targeting is that if you use a class with a long-range skill, you are bound to get a cross-map if a person has done an NCM before hopping. Now, since teleporting and cross-mapping really balances each other out, a game where you can consistently trigger these glitches is more preferable than a game where these happen at mostly random. By utilizing macros, which most players have these days, you can consistently and reliably trigger these glitches and use them to outsmart your opponents. So using macros when PvPing just allows for more complex gameplay. One thing to mention about macros is that the frequency you try to trigger an attack request or a movement will make you lag, and since network latency is quite important for a game as simple as this, you have to find a balance between the spam rate of your macros. As we have just touched in on network latency, I think it's important to mention first hit priority, that even if a crossmap might trigger faster than a door camp, this hit priority really doesn't mean anything, since network latency or ping is what really determines who will get first hit, since it shows how fast a person can both see you and trigger a request to the servers, meaning that people with a higher ping almost never will get first hit and also might have problems getting a successful attack in on a person with a lower ping. Ping is also what determines how fast you can hop, since there is a hop request being sent to the servers when you're trying to initiate a hop. As for this last section, I figured it's necessary to talk about the implications glitches have for the game and how RTX Entertainment can fix them, but also touch on the subject if they should keep the glitches in the game, since it allows for more complex gameplay. So before I talk about C as the problem that creates most of these glitches, I think the idea that is put forward with having one map that allows to use some of these glitches talked about in this video is a phenomenal idea, since it's mainly what the 4311 community has built its basis on for many years now. And it also can attract players who are more interested in PvP and allow them to have a more complex experience with the game. So talking about the glitches that definitely should be fixed and only breaks the game and doesn't allow for anything cool, we first off have the T glitch, which happens when you are teeing off of someone onto someone that is not in the room. Then you get soft locked to that character. Second of all, we have party glitch, essentially where if you're in a party with someone trying to fight them in PvP, the party gets sort of broken for the player who's already in the map when one of the players you have in your party joins the room. This happens not 100% of the time, but after a few rejoins of the room. Third off on the list is the no back glitch, which is just an area that is counted out of bounds and can be used in a non-fair way. Fourth on the list is pointer click teleportations. Now I understand that the implications of character separations are to try and counter bots or hacks that allow for infinite range, but I do think that pointer click teleportations are a type of character separations that only creates problems and doesn't solve much, since pointer click teleportations are caused by delay and they only create door lag for players, which can be quite frustrating. on the list as well is roofing, since if you're able to fix it so people can't do a perfect roof, then I see no way of people being able to go outside of the map. Though I can understand that it can be difficult to find a solution to roofing, as I will talk about in a later section, implementing a hop delay is probably not such a good solution, though I see roofing as a glitch that has to be fixed. And the last thing on the list is obviously that you're still able to move using dashing when you're stunned, which allows for stun glitches and other weird behavior that is not balanced fairly. Two bugs in the game that definitely has to be fixed are what we call damage boosting and potions, since these have implications that allow players to have extra benefits without there being no way to tell that they have this advantage. The other bug or thing I would like to see changed is that when you're using potions, you can essentially use one potion and have it last for 50 minutes, but you are not required to have that potion equipped for that duration. This allows players to use potions that boost their stats and then store that potion in their bank. This essentially allows them to get whatever stat boost they want, and again we can't go to their character page and check if they have potions in their inventory, which allows them to get away with cheating. So it would be a necessity to see potions that are either active or that you have to have a potion equipped for that duration for the effects to last. One quick solution to this might be that you mark a character's selective box with an icon that indicates that it has potions active. As of this recording, the attack function in the game is currently broken, but what I'm going to reflect upon and the glitches I'm going to talk about reflect the old way, or the way that we are used to seeing the attack function working. And the glitches that I think really balance and allows for more complex PvPing are teleportations and cross maps. Since when players get the understanding of how these glitches work and the fact that they can use macros to trigger them frequently, I think what we looked at in this video really goes to show that, if possible, having these glitches enabled in a map could do no harm. Though if I were to add one thing to the discussion, I would really argue that if you're going to make a separate non-OP map, just keep the same layout as in Blood Red Brawl, but keep it so that you cannot kill any of the monsters. Since we use the monsters to regain both health and mana off the waves, so they are quite essential to have, but they also allow for more variation within the map. Though killing them essentially makes it so we have to rejoin the game to keep track of the points. So if it was possible to make it so that they couldn't be killed, but we could still regain mana and health from them, that would be awesome. And also, just a rumor I've heard is that there is going to be implemented a hop cap, which means that everyone will get slower hops. Now I think that is a bad idea, since it's obvious that it's beneficial for people with a lower ping. I still think that the game itself needs all of the quickness that it has to allow players to not be handicapped by the game speed itself, but more their own skills. And as technology gets better, the general network latency will be less of a problem. So implementing a hop cap will only be a handicap for everyone.